What happens when one of Hollywood's most laid-back actors loses his cool on live television? The answer involves a heated exchange that left an entire studio audience speechless, a host scrambling to regain control, and millions of viewers witnessing something they never expected to see from Matthew McConaughey. Before we get into what went down, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and drop a comment below, telling us what you think really caused this explosion. Now let's dive into how a seemingly innocent interview turned into one of the most jaw-dropping moments in daytime television history. Kelly Clarkson opened the segment with her trademark energy, welcoming Matthew to the stage as the audience erupted in applause. The initial moments felt comfortable, familiar even, as they settled into their seats, and Kelly launched into her first question about his latest project. Matthew leaned back, that signature smile playing across his face, as he began talking about the film he'd been promoting all week. His voice carried that smooth Texas drawl everyone recognizes, measured and thoughtful as always. Kelly nodded along, laughing at his anecdotes about working with the director and the challenges of shooting in remote locations. The conversation flowed easily through the first few minutes, touching on his preparation for the role and the physical demands of the performance. Matthew described early morning workouts and long days under the desert sun, painting a picture of dedication that resonated with the audience. Everything seemed perfectly normal, exactly what you'd expect from a seasoned actor making the rounds on the talk show circuit. Then Kelly shifted gears, her tone becoming more casual as she brought up something she'd read online. She mentioned an article that discussed his views on parenting and how he and his wife chose to raise their children away from the Hollywood spotlight. Matthew's expression changed subtly, the easy smile tightening just slightly at the corners. He acknowledged the article with a brief nod but didn't elaborate, clearly hoping to move past the topic quickly. Kelly pressed forward, though, referencing specific quotes from the piece about limiting technology and maintaining traditional family values. She framed it as admirable, praising his commitment to giving his kids a grounded upbringing. But there was something in her delivery, a slight edge that suggested she might be building toward something more pointed. Matthew shifted in his seat, his posture straightening as he chose his words more carefully now. He explained that, yes, they did make conscious choices about their children's exposure to certain aspects of modern culture, but it wasn't about being restrictive or old-fashioned. It was about creating space for imagination and real-world experiences. His voice remained steady, but you could hear the defensive undertone creeping in. Kelly smiled and agreed enthusiastically, but then she asked if he thought other parents were failing by not following similar principles. The question landed like a stone. Matthew's eyebrows rose slightly, and he took a moment before responding. He said that wasn't what he meant at all, that every family had to make their own decisions based on their own circumstances. He emphasized that he wasn't judging anyone else's parenting choices. Kelly nodded but immediately followed up by pointing out that in the article, he'd used the phrase "lost generation" when discussing kids who grow up entirely online. Matthew's jaw tightened. He clarified that the quote had been taken out of context, that he was speaking about a broader societal trend, not attacking individual parents. His hands moved more animatedly now as he spoke, gesturing to emphasize his points. Kelly leaned forward, her expression still friendly but her questions becoming sharper. She asked if he realized how privileged his perspective was, having the resources to choose a specific lifestyle for his family, while many parents struggled just to keep their children safe and fed. The temperature in the studio shifted. You could feel it in the way the audience grew quieter, in how Matthew's relaxed demeanor had completely evaporated. He acknowledged that yes, he was fortunate, but that didn't invalidate the concerns he had about where culture was heading for all children. Kelly countered by suggesting that perhaps his concerns came from a place of being out of touch with how most families actually lived. Matthew's response came quicker this time, his voice carrying a new intensity. He said he found it interesting that she was suddenly painting him as some disconnected elitist, when just 5 minutes ago she'd been praising these same choices. Kelly's smile wavered for just a second before she recovered, explaining that she was simply playing devil's advocate, trying to explore different perspectives on the topic. But Matthew wasn't backing down anymore. He pointed out that this felt less like exploring perspectives and more like a setup, like she'd invited him on the show specifically to challenge him on something personal. Kelly's expression hardened slightly as she insisted that wasn't the case at all, that these were legitimate questions that many viewers would want answered. The exchange was escalating rapidly now, both of them speaking with more force, their words coming faster. Matthew said if she had issues with his parenting philosophy, she should have been upfront about it instead of disguising it as casual conversation. Kelly shot back that, as a journalist, she had every right to ask tough questions, especially when someone puts their views out in public through interviews and articles. Matthew leaned forward, his voice dropping lower but somehow carrying more weight. He told her there was a difference between journalism and ambush, between asking hard questions and misrepresenting someone's words to create conflict. The audience was completely silent now, every eye fixed on the two figures on stage. Kelly's professional composure was cracking, her own frustration beginning to show through. She asked Matthew if he expected to share his opinions publicly without ever being challenged on them. He replied that he welcomed honest discussion, but this wasn't honest. This was her twisting his words and assigning meanings he'd never intended. Kelly insisted she was only reading from the article, using his own quotes. Matthew's voice rose as he said that reading selectively and ignoring context was exactly how you misrepresent someone. The tension had become almost unbearable. Kelly tried to steer toward a commercial break, but Matthew kept talking, saying this was exactly what was wrong with modern media. This need to manufacture controversy where none existed. Kelly's face flushed as she defended her show and her integrity as a host. She said she'd built her career on authentic conversations, and she wasn't going to be lectured by someone who clearly couldn't handle having their views examined. That's when Matthew stood up. Not aggressively, but deliberately, his movement commanding immediate attention. The audience gasped collectively, unsure what was about to happen. Kelly looked up at him, momentarily thrown by this unexpected action. Matthew's voice was controlled but unmistakably angry, as he said he'd come here in good faith to talk about his work, and instead found himself defending his family against manufactured outrage. Kelly stood as well, facing him directly now. She told him he was being dramatic, that if he couldn't handle standard interview questions, then maybe he shouldn't do press tours. Matthew's laugh was bitter as he responded that there was nothing standard about what just happened, that she knew exactly what she was doing when she steered the conversation this direction. The studio crew was frozen, cameras still rolling, capturing every second of this unscripted confrontation. Kelly's voice rose as she said she wouldn't apologize for doing her job, for asking questions that her audience deserved answers to. Matthew fired back that her audience deserved honest conversation, not gotcha journalism designed to create viral moments. They were face to face now, both breathing hard, the polite veneer of the interview completely shattered. Kelly's producer was gesturing frantically from off-camera, but neither of them acknowledged it. Matthew's voice cut through the tension as he told Kelly that she'd clearly decided, before he even walked out here, what narrative she wanted to push. Kelly's eyes flashed as she shot back that he was paranoid, that not everything was a conspiracy against him. Matthew shook his head slowly, his frustration evident in every movement. He asked her point-blank why she brought up that specific article, out of the hundreds of interviews he'd done recently. Why that particular topic? Why frame those particular quotes in that particular way? Kelly hesitated for just a moment, and that hesitation told Matthew everything he needed to know. He let out a long breath and said he should have seen this coming, that he'd heard rumors about her show looking to generate more controversy to compete with other daytime programs. That accusation hit a nerve. Kelly's professional mask dropped completely as she told him he had no idea what he was talking about, that her show's success spoke for itself. Matthew countered that success built on manufactured drama wasn't real success, it was exploitation. Kelly's voice shook slightly as she insisted she'd never exploited anyone, that every conversation on her show was authentic and real. Matthew gestured broadly at the space between them, asking if this felt authentic to her. He said when he agreed to appear, he thought he was sitting down with Kelly Clarkson, the artist, the person who'd always seemed genuine and kind in every interaction he'd seen. Instead, he got Kelly Clarkson, the ratings chaser, willing to sacrifice integrity for clicks and views. The words landed hard, and you could see the hurt flash across Kelly's face before anger replaced it. She told him he was being incredibly unfair, that she'd asked legitimate questions that arose naturally from things he'd publicly stated. Matthew laughed without humor and said there was nothing natural about the way she'd prosecuted him over his parenting choices. Kelly snapped back that if his choices were so righteous and well thought out, he shouldn't have any problem defending them under scrutiny. Matthew's voice dropped dangerously low as he said, "This wasn't about defending anything. This was about respecting boundaries between professional discussion and personal attack." Kelly threw her hands up and declared that he'd literally written about these topics in his book, talked about them in interviews, made them part of his public persona. She asked how that made them off limits for discussion. The audience was watching this like a tennis match, heads turning back and forth as each person landed their points. Matthew explained slowly, as if speaking to someone who was deliberately misunderstanding, that discussing his choices was fine, but mischaracterizing them to paint him as some judgmental elitist was not fine. Kelly's face reddened as she insisted once again that she'd only quoted his own words. Matthew pulled out his phone, his movements sharp and deliberate. He scrolled quickly and then began reading from the actual article, providing the full context around the quotes Kelly had cherry-picked. The difference was stark and immediate. In full context, his statements were thoughtful observations about cultural shifts, not attacks on other parents. He looked up at Kelly and asked if she'd actually read the entire article or just the excerpts her producers had highlighted for her. Kelly's silence answered the question. The realization rippled through the audience, a collective understanding that they'd just witnessed something shift. Kelly recovered quickly, though, her media training kicking in as she said that regardless of context, the concerns he raised still came from a place of privilege. Matthew's frustration boiled over as he said privilege wasn't a weapon you could use to dismiss someone's opinions, that it was possible to be fortunate and still care about broader societal issues. He continued, his voice gaining strength as he pointed out that Kelly herself came from humble beginnings and worked her way to success, so she should understand better than anyone that caring about cultural problems wasn't exclusive to any economic class. Kelly bristled at having her own background brought into the discussion, telling Matthew not to presume he knew anything about her experiences or perspectives. Matthew spread his hands wide and said that was exactly his point, that she'd spent the last 15 minutes presuming to know his motivations and beliefs without actually listening to what he was saying. Kelly argued that she had listened, she just didn't agree with what she heard. Matthew shook his head and said disagreement was fine, welcomed even. But distortion wasn't disagreement. It was dishonesty. The word hung in the air between them. Dishonesty. Kelly's face went pale and then flushed dark red. Her voice shook as she told Matthew he needed to be very careful about accusing her of lying on her own show. Matthew didn't back down, stating calmly that he'd called it distortion, which was exactly what selective quoting amounted to. Kelly said that was semantics and he knew it. Matthew agreed it was semantics, and semantics mattered, which was why he was so angry about his words being twisted in the first place. He pointed out the irony of Kelly getting upset about precise language after spending the interview being imprecise with his quotes. Kelly looked like she wanted to say something cutting but visibly stopped herself, taking a breath and attempting to regain some composure. She suggested they move on to other topics, but Matthew wasn't having it. He said they couldn't just move on, that this wasn't a minor disagreement they could paper over with small talk about his next movie. Kelly insisted that continuing down this path wasn't productive for anyone. Matthew countered that maybe productivity wasn't the goal, maybe accountability was. Kelly's eyes narrowed as she asked what exactly he wanted from her. An apology? A retraction? Matthew said he wanted her to acknowledge what she'd done, to admit that she'd approached this interview with an agenda rather than genuine curiosity. Kelly firmly stated she had no such agenda, that he was reading malice into standard journalistic practice. Matthew's laugh was sharp and humorless. He said if this was standard journalistic practice, then journalism was in worse shape than he thought. Kelly defended her profession and her colleagues, saying Matthew was painting with far too broad a brush. He agreed he was generalizing but said the specific example standing right in front of him wasn't doing much to counter his broader point. The personal nature of the attacks was escalating. Kelly told Matthew he was being condescending, talking down to her like she was incapable of understanding basic concepts. Matthew replied that he was frustrated, not condescending, and there was a significant difference. Kelly said the effect was the same regardless of his intention, throwing his own logic about context back at him. Matthew acknowledged the point with a slight nod, admitting that was fair. For a brief moment it seemed like they might find some common ground, some way to de-escalate. But then Kelly added that maybe he should consider how his choices, however well-intentioned, might come across to parents who don't have the luxury of opting out of mainstream culture. And just like that, they were right back in it. Matthew's jaw clenched as he said she was doing it again, reframing his personal family decisions as some sort of judgment on others. Kelly insisted that impact mattered more than intention, that he couldn't control how people interpreted his public statements. Matthew agreed about impact, but said she was deliberately amplifying a negative interpretation that most reasonable people wouldn't naturally arrive at. Kelly challenged that assertion, saying she was simply voicing concerns that many viewers likely shared. Matthew asked if she'd actually heard from viewers expressing those concerns, or if she was projecting her own feelings onto an imaginary audience. Kelly stammered slightly, caught off guard by the directness of the question. She said she didn't need to hear from every individual viewer to understand general sentiments. Matthew pressed the point, asking how she could claim to speak for her audience without actually consulting them. Kelly's frustration exploded as she said she'd been doing this job for years. She understood her viewers. She didn't need Matthew McConaughey explaining her own audience to her. Matthew raised his voice to match hers, saying he wasn't explaining her audience. He was questioning her assumption that they all shared her antagonistic reading of his statements. The conversation had devolved into something raw and real, all pretense of media polish stripped away. Both of them were speaking from places of genuine emotion now, the careful PR-friendly personas completely abandoned. Kelly accused Matthew of being unable to accept criticism, of thinking his celebrity status should shield him from hard questions. Matthew fired back that he faced criticism all the time. What he couldn't accept was bad faith interrogation, masquerading as conversation. Kelly demanded to know what made this bad faith. Matthew listed the points methodically, his anger giving way to a cold precision that was somehow more cutting. The selective quoting, the loaded framing, the refusal to engage with his actual positions in favor of attacking straw men. Kelly listened with her arms crossed, her body language screaming defensiveness even as she tried to maintain eye contact. When Matthew finished his methodical breakdown of everything wrong with the interview approach, Kelly stood there silent for a long moment. The studio audience barely breathed, waiting to see how she would respond. Her voice was quieter when she finally spoke, but no less intense. She told Matthew that he was essentially accusing her of being a bad interviewer, of not knowing how to do her job, and she found that insulting given her track record. Matthew's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy but with something closer to resignation. He said he wasn't questioning her abilities as an interviewer in general. He was questioning her choices in this specific interview. Kelly asked what the difference was, how he could separate her professional competence from her professional decisions. Matthew explained that capable people could still make poor choices, that intelligence and skill didn't prevent mistakes. Kelly seized on that word. Mistakes. She asked if he was now saying this was just a mistake, something unintentional. Matthew clarified that whether it was intentional or not, didn't change the impact on him, sitting here having his words twisted. Kelly's voice rose again, as she insisted, for what felt like the 100th time, that she had not twisted anything. Matthew's exhaustion was visible now as he said they were going in circles, that clearly neither of them was going to convince the other. But Kelly wasn't ready to let it go. She said that if they were going in circles, it was because Matthew refused to acknowledge any validity in her perspective. He challenged that immediately, asking what perspective exactly she wanted him to validate. Kelly struggled for a moment to articulate it clearly, then said that his lifestyle choices, however personal, did carry implicit judgments about alternative choices. Matthew's voice was sharp as he rejected that entirely. He said choosing what was right for his family didn't mean judging what was right for others. Kelly countered that human psychology didn't work that way, that when someone prominently chooses one path and discusses it publicly, they're inherently suggesting that path is superior. Matthew looked genuinely baffled, asking if she really believed people couldn't make personal choices without it being a commentary on everyone else's choices. Kelly said that in an ideal world maybe, but in reality, especially when you're a public figure with influence, your choices send messages whether you intend them to or not. Matthew's frustration reignited as he said that was an impossible standard, that by her logic, any choice any public figure made about anything could be construed as judgment. Kelly agreed that yes, actually, that was the reality of being famous. That influence came with responsibility. Matthew asked her then why she became a talk show host, instead of continuing to focus purely on music. Did that choice imply she was judging musicians who didn't branch out into other media? Kelly said that was different, and Matthew immediately pounced, asking how it was different. Kelly fumbled slightly, saying it just was. The contexts weren't comparable. Matthew pressed harder, saying either all choices by public figures were implicit judgments, or none were. She couldn't have it both ways. Kelly's face showed the strain of trying to maintain her position under Matthew's logical assault. She pivoted, saying that parenting choices were fundamentally different from career choices because they involved children who couldn't consent to being part of public narratives. Matthew agreed completely, which seemed to surprise Kelly. He said that was exactly why he was so careful about what he shared publicly, why he spoke in general terms about values rather than specific details about his kids. Kelly pointed out that he'd still discussed enough for articles to be written and interviews to be given. Matthew said there was a balance, that completely hiding his family would be dishonest, given that they were such an important part of his life, but exploiting them for publicity would be unconscionable. He asked if Kelly could see the difference between acknowledging their existence and making them content. Kelly nodded slowly, seeming to genuinely consider the distinction. She admitted that maybe she could see that difference. For the first time since the confrontation began, her tone lost some of its edge. She said that perhaps she had conflated his discussion of parenting philosophy with exploitation of his children, and those weren't the same thing. Matthew's shoulders dropped slightly, tension releasing as he heard what sounded like the beginning of understanding. But then Kelly added that even with that distinction, his philosophy still bothered her because it felt disconnected from reality for most families. And just like that, the brief détente shattered. Matthew's hands went up in a gesture of disbelief. He said they'd just made progress, and she immediately threw them back into the same argument. Kelly insisted she was allowed to have her feelings about his philosophy, even while acknowledging he wasn't exploiting his kids. Matthew said of course she was allowed her feelings, but this was supposed to be an interview, not a debate about his personal life. Kelly countered that his personal life was part of what made him interesting to audiences, that people wanted to know about the whole person, not just the actor. Matthew agreed but said there was a way to explore someone's life with curiosity rather than hostility. Kelly's defenses went back up at the word hostility. She said she had not been hostile, that Matthew was exaggerating her tone and approach. Matthew laughed incredulously and gestured to the space around them, to the tense audience, to the crew members watching with concerned expressions. He said if this wasn't hostility, then he'd hate to see what she considered an actual confrontation. Kelly told him he was being dramatic again, playing up the situation for effect. Matthew's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet level again as he said there were hundreds of witnesses and multiple cameras capturing every moment of this, that anyone watching could judge for themselves whether he was exaggerating. Kelly seemed to realize the implications of that, how this would look when clips inevitably spread across social media and news outlets. Her expression shifted, calculation replacing anger as the professional side of her brain started working through the damage control that would be necessary. Matthew saw the change and called it out immediately. He said he could see her switching modes, thinking about the optics instead of the actual issues they'd been discussing. Kelly denied it, but not convincingly. Matthew shook his head and said this was exactly the problem, that media figures were so focused on perception management, they'd lost touch with authentic communication. Kelly's voice was cold as she told Matthew he was being incredibly self-righteous for someone who'd built a career on carefully managed public image. Matthew didn't deny having a public image, but said there was a difference between being thoughtful about what you share and being calculatingly dishonest. Kelly asked if he was calling her calculatingly dishonest now. Matthew said he was calling the media landscape calculatingly dishonest, and she was participating in it whether she wanted to admit it or not. Kelly told him that was a cop-out, making broad statements about the media instead of addressing her specific actions. Matthew said fine, he'd be specific. Her specific actions in this specific interview demonstrated exactly the kind of cynical gotcha approach that eroded trust between public figures and audiences. Kelly's eyes blazed as she said if there was eroded trust, maybe it was because public figures like him expected softball questions and praised without ever being challenged. Matthew's voice rose to meet hers as he said he was fine being challenged. He welcomed it. What he didn't welcome was intellectual dishonesty disguised as challenging journalism. Kelly shouted back that there was nothing intellectually dishonest about her questions. Matthew shouted that the questions themselves weren't the problem. It was the framing, the context, the underlying assumptions she brought to them. They were both fully yelling now, all pretense of civility abandoned. The producer was making cutting motions, trying desperately to get them to stop, but they were too locked into the confrontation to notice or care. Kelly accused Matthew of being unable to handle strong women questioning him. Matthew's face went dark at that accusation. His voice was dangerously quiet as he said that was a cheap shot, that plenty of women had challenged him over the years, and he'd never reacted this way because they'd done so honestly. Kelly's accusation about him not being able to handle strong women hung in the air like smoke. Matthew's voice was steady, but you could hear the anger underneath as he told her that reducing this entire confrontation to gender dynamics was dismissive of the actual issues at hand. Kelly said she was just pointing out a pattern she'd observed. Matthew asked what pattern. When had he ever shown disrespect to women interviewers? Kelly couldn't provide specific examples, instead saying it was more about the intensity of his reaction to her specifically. Matthew's response was cutting. He said the intensity of his reaction matched the intensity of her misrepresentation, that he would have responded exactly the same way regardless of who was conducting the interview. Kelly's expression suggested she didn't quite believe him. Matthew could see it, and his frustration deepened. He told her that if she wanted to make this about identity rather than actions, she was welcome to, but it was just another deflection from the actual problem. The audience was shifting uncomfortably now. This had gone so far beyond normal interview territory that many of them looked like they wished they could leave, but were too transfixed to move. Kelly seemed to register their discomfort and made another attempt to regain control of the situation. She suggested they take a break and come back to finish the interview on a better note. Matthew's laugh was bitter as he said there was no coming back from this, that the interview was effectively over the moment she decided to ambush him. Kelly's voice went sharp again at the word ambush. She said she was tired of that characterization, that she'd asked reasonable questions that he simply didn't want to answer. Matthew countered that he'd answered every single question. What he hadn't done was accept her hostile framing. Kelly threw her hands up and asked what she was supposed to do. Just accept everything he said without pushing back. Matthew said pushing back was fine. Twisting his words was not. They were at an impasse. Both of them dug into their positions with no apparent path toward resolution. The energy in the studio had shifted from shocked anticipation to exhausted tension. Even the crew members who'd seen countless interviews go sideways looked unsure how to handle this situation. Kelly glanced toward her producer, who gave a helpless shrug. No clear guidance forthcoming. Matthew seemed to come to a decision. His posture changed, tension draining out as he clearly prepared to leave. He told Kelly that he appreciated her having him on the show, but this conversation had run its course. Kelly asked if he was seriously just going to walk out. Matthew said he was, that staying would only lead to more circular arguments that helped no one. Kelly's professional pride was wounded by the suggestion that a guest would abandon her show mid-interview. She told him that walking out would make him look bad, that it would seem like he couldn't defend his positions. Matthew's smile was sad as he said he'd been defending his positions for the last half hour. What he couldn't defend against was someone determined to misunderstand him. Kelly insisted one more time that she hadn't misunderstood anything. Matthew just shook his head, too tired to relitigate the same ground again. He thanked the audience for their patience and started to turn away from the interview area. Kelly called after him, asking if he had anything else to say, any final thoughts he wanted to share. Matthew paused and turned back, considering the question. He said that his final thought was that this entire exchange perfectly illustrated why so many public figures were becoming more guarded and less willing to share authentic parts of themselves. Kelly bristled at the implication that this was somehow her fault. She said that if public figures wanted good press, they needed to be prepared for scrutiny. Matthew's response was immediate and forceful. He said scrutiny was welcome. Character assassination dressed up as scrutiny was not. Kelly's face flushed again as she denied engaging in character assassination. Matthew gestured broadly at everything that had happened and said she could call it whatever she wanted. But the evidence spoke for itself. The finality in his tone seemed to land with Kelly in a way the previous arguments hadn't. Her expression shifted, something that might have been regret flickering across her face. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. Matthew waited, giving her the space to speak if she chose to. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and charged with possibility. Finally, Kelly spoke, her voice quieter than it had been at any point during the confrontation. She said that maybe things had gotten out of hand, that maybe they'd both said things in the heat of the moment. Matthew acknowledged that was true, but added that heat of the moment didn't change the fundamental issue of how the interview had been approached. Kelly asked if there was any way to move past this, to find some common ground. Matthew considered the question seriously. He said that moving past it would require Kelly to genuinely examine her interview tactics and decide if this was how she wanted to run her show. Kelly asked Matthew what he wanted from her in this moment. Matthew said he didn't want anything from her, that this was her show and her decision to make. But for himself, he was done with interviews that prioritized conflict over understanding. Kelly pointed out that conflict made for compelling television. Matthew agreed it did, but asked at what cost. That question hung in the air between them. Kelly didn't have a ready answer. Matthew could see her actually grappling with it, and he softened slightly. He said he understood the pressures she was under. Kelly nodded, looking almost grateful for the acknowledgement. Matthew extended his hand and Kelly shook it, a formal gesture that felt more like ending a business negotiation than concluding a friendly chat. Matthew thanked her again for having him, and walked off the stage without looking back. Kelly watched him go, her expression unreadable before turning to face her audience with a forced smile. The audience applauded uncertainly, unsure what the appropriate response was to what they'd just witnessed. Kelly tried to transition into wrapping up the show, but her usual sparkle was dimmed. She stumbled over her words slightly, the confident host persona struggling to reassert itself after such a raw and public confrontation. What started as a routine promotional appearance had transformed into something entirely different, a collision between media expectations and personal boundaries that neither party had expected. The carefully maintained illusion of easy celebrity conversation had been shattered, revealing the tensions that simmer beneath the surface of most public interactions. So what do you think really triggered Matthew's explosion? Was Kelly out of line with her questions, or was Matthew too sensitive about his parenting choices? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure you're subscribed to catch more stories about the moments when celebrity interviews go completely off the rails.